I was 12 years old, living in North Memphis, and they had played the record the first time the night before. And it was basically a rhythm and blues station.
He is 86 now, and most people who pass him would never guess how close he once stood to the most famous man on earth. The jawline is softened, the hair is thin, and his hands hesitate when he picks up a glass. To the outside world, he is just another old man fighting gravity and time. Inside, he is someone who has carried one night in his chest for almost 50 years, a night he has never really spoken about until now. Over the years, people tried to drag that night out of him. Writers sent contracts thick as phone books. Television producers promised primetime specials. Fans sent letters in shaky handwriting asking for the real story about Elvis. In those final years, each time he said no. After the sirens stopped and the newspapers moved on, he swore he would not turn Elvis's worst moments into his own retirement plan. Keeping quiet was the only way he knew to stay loyal. That loyalty meant watching other people tell the story instead. He has sat alone in front of his television and listened to strangers piece together Elvis's life from secondhand quotes and half-remembered nights. He has heard men who barely made it past the front gates of Graceland speak as if they knew every secret in the house. He has looked down at his hands, knowing there are things he saw and heard that would change the way people talk about Elvis forever, and choosing again and again not to open his mouth. The rumors were the worst part. Conspiracy theories that said Elvis never died. Stories about secret islands, plastic surgery, new passports, a king hiding in plain sight. Every time someone swore they had seen Elvis pumping gas or buying groceries under another name, it hit him like a small punch, because he knew what nobody out there understood. There was a night when Elvis truly vanished from the life everyone thought they controlled. And it had nothing to do with fake identities or staged deaths. It happened long before ambulances flashed red and blue outside Graceland. On paper, it was supposed to be a quiet night. No show, no flight, no screaming crowds waiting in some other city. Elvis was meant to be at home, moving through the same rooms he had walked 1,000 times. The staff believed they knew where he was. Security believed they knew his routine. Then, somewhere between one breath and the next, he was simply not where he was supposed to be. He remembers that realization like it happened last week. The weight of the house keys in his pocket as he checked room after room. The way the big familiar spaces suddenly felt too wide and too empty. Guards trying to sound casual on the intercom while their eyes betrayed something closer to fear. Elvis Presley, the man the world could track by taillights and flight numbers, was off the grid inside his own kingdom, and nobody could say when he had slipped away or which direction he had gone. To understand why that memory still keeps him awake, you have to understand who Elvis was to him before the chaos. This was not just an employer. They were two Southern boys who had shared long car rides, greasy diner food, bad jokes, and better secrets. He had watched Elvis buy Graceland not as a trophy, but as a promise to his parents that they would never be poor again. He had seen the kid from Tupelo trying to carry a grown man's burden long before his body was ready for it. Because of that closeness, he started noticing the cracks earlier than most. The nights when Elvis sang gospel until sunrise because he did not want to be alone in his own head. The long flights where the laughter died and Elvis stared out at the dark through small oval windows. The way the medicine bottles multiplied and the jokes about disappearing for a while slipped into conversations more often than anyone wanted to admit. At the time, those lines sounded like worn-out humor. At 86, he hears them now as warnings they all ignored. For decades, he has lived with the knowledge that there was one night when those half-jokes turned into something real, when Elvis actually walked out into the Memphis darkness without telling the people who would have followed him anywhere. He knows where that drive ended. He knows what was said when they finally found him. He knows how the look in Elvis's eyes shifted from restless to something closer to resigned, like a man who had already stepped one foot out of his own life. And he knows that once he shares this story, there is no pulling it back. Once he describes the roads, the words, the moment Elvis used the word disappear in a way he never had before, fans will debate it, twist it, argue about what it means. That fear has kept him quiet longer than any contract. But time has taken his speed, most of his friends, and nearly every chance to speak in his own voice. What it has not taken is his memory of that night. So he sits down now, slower than before, but surer than he has ever been, and finally lets the sentence cross the line between his mind and the air. There was a night when Elvis Presley disappeared long before any coroner signed a piece of paper, and he was there to see it. Then he looks straight ahead as if he can see both the past and the people listening, and admits softly, "That was the night Elvis disappeared, and I have never told anyone exactly what happened until now." It began like 100 other nights in the last stretch of his life, the kind of evening that should have blurred into all the others. The house was awake even though Memphis was not. Lights burned in rooms nobody was using. A television mumbled to itself in a back bedroom. Somewhere downstairs, somebody was frying something they should not have been eating at that hour. On the schedule, there was nothing dramatic planned. No stage, no airport, no screaming crowd waiting on the other side of a curtain. Elvis was supposed to be home, inside walls that had seen every version of him. He remembers the air feeling heavy even before anything went wrong. Elvis had been restless all day, pacing from room to room with that slow, uneven stride that said his body hurt more than he would admit. He held conversations in fragments, starting a sentence about business and ending it with some half-forgotten joke from Tupelo. The medicine bottles had become part of the furniture. Open a drawer and they were there. Move a jacket and you might hear a rattle. It made the friend feel like he was walking through a pharmacy that had been disguised as a mansion. There was a moment just after midnight when everything still felt salvageable. Elvis stood in the den, turning a small bottle over in his hand like he could read his future in the label. Music drifted low from a pair of speakers, one of those gospel records he always went back to when his nerves were bad. The friend watched him stare into the middle distance for a few beats, then watched the familiar mask slide back into place. Elvis cracked a small smile that didn't reach his eyes, said he would be upstairs in a bit, and waved him off like it was nothing. The call that pulled him away was trivial. Some question about arrangements, some argument between staff that needed a grown voice to settle it. He left the room annoyed but not alarmed. In his mind, Elvis was 15 steps away from a bed, maybe 20 away from the bathroom, nowhere near danger. He handled the dispute, signed something, told two grown men to stop acting like children. It took longer than he thought. When he finally turned back toward the heart of the house, the weird quiet hit him like a wall. At first, he blamed the feeling on his own nerves. Graceland could fall silent in a way that felt peaceful on some nights and haunted on others. He went to the den and found an empty chair, a half-finished drink sweating on the table. The Kevin were to record the stees, pure in nature, and you're still turning in slow circles. He called out, not loudly, expecting an answer from the hallway or the stairs. The only reply was the soft crackle of the needle running in the groove. A chill walked up his spine before his brain had time to give it a name. He started with the obvious places: upstairs, bedroom, bathroom, dressing room, the music room. Each door swung open on spaces that felt like someone had just stepped out of them. A jacket tossed across a chair. A pair of shoes kicked half under a table. Signs of a man you could not lay eyes on. His voice grew firmer as he asked guards when they had last seen Elvis. One said it had been an hour, another said longer, and suddenly the timeline that kept everyone calm began to crumble. The fear did not arrive in a scream. It seeped in through small things. A back door that was unlocked when it should not have been. A car that was not where it belonged. A guard swearing he had not seen anybody use the front gate. Elvis was a grown man who had once roamed entire cities without anyone knowing where he was. But this was different. This was a body that did not handle exertion well anymore. This was a heart that had been warned. This was a man whose bad days were getting closer together, not farther apart. He moved faster than his memory likes to admit. He sent people to the grounds, to the stables, to the little building by the pool. He listened to the crackle of radios as voices checked in, each one coming back with the same useless report. Nothing. Elvis's father was asleep. The world outside the gates kept breathing, completely unaware that inside the man who drew crowds like a magnet was unaccounted for in his own sanctuary. The friend stood in the doorway, staring out at the dark Memphis streets beyond the stone walls, and realized Elvis had done what he had been joking about for months. He had slipped away. He knew where to look, not because of any security camera or clever plan, but because he knew the man. When Elvis talked about disappearing, he never described beaches or foreign countries. He talked about small places, quiet corners, the kind of churches and streets that looked like the world before it recognized his face. So the friend took a set of keys, climbed behind the wheel, and pointed the car toward the side of town that still smelled like his own past. He found him parked outside a tiny brick church that had no idea who sat under its faded sign. Elvis was in the front seat, engine off, windows cracked just enough to let air in. No disguise, no effort to hide. He looked less like an outlaw on the run, and more like a man who had driven back to the last place he remembered feeling simple. When the friend opened the passenger door and slid in, Elvis did not jump or apologize. He gave a small, tired smile, like he had been expecting him all along. The conversation that followed did not sound like the banter people imagine. Elvis did not talk about fame or money. He talked about weight, the kind that settled on his chest when he tried to sleep, the kind that pills could not dissolve. He admitted there were nights when he looked at his own reflection and did not recognize the man staring back. He said he felt like he was watching Elvis Presley from the outside, like a character someone else was playing, while the real him sat somewhere in the dark, waiting to be noticed. The friend tried to pull him back with the names that always worked. Lisa Marie, Vernon, the fans who sent letters by the bagful, the ones who still cried at the gate years after the first hits faded from the charts. On late nights, he would see a familiar incident described on a talk show and feel something in him flinch, not because it was entirely false, but because important pieces were missing. Nobody knew about the night when Elvis slipped out of his own house to sit in front of a church and talk about vanishing. Without that context, the picture the world saw felt crooked. Years slid into decades. His own body began to send warnings he could not ignore. Knees gave out, breaths came shorter. Doctors started using the same patient, calm voice on him that he had once heard used on Elvis. Each time he looked at a prescription bottle, he thought about that label in Elvis's hand. Each time he lay awake at 3 a.m, he knew exactly which memory was going to show up first. It was always the car, the church silhouette, and the sentence about not coming back. The belief that silence was the most loyal choice began to crack as his days grew shorter. He started to wonder who exactly he had been protecting all this time. Elvis was beyond scandal. The people who had profited off his exhaustion were mostly gone or fading. The only ones left, for the most part, were the fans who still stood at the gates with flowers and children who knew the songs from worn-out records their grandparents played. Those people were not asking for a cleaner myth. They were asking to know the man. Sitting in a small house far from the noise of the old days, he found himself thinking less about protecting Elvis's image and more about whether he had robbed that man of something important by staying quiet. If the world had understood just how trapped Elvis felt, would they have begged harder for mercy on his schedule? Would they have looked at him with more compassion and less judgment during those final years? There were no answers, only questions circling the same regret. One truth became impossible to avoid. The story he had carried alone was going to outlive him one way or another. Either it would die with him, leaving that night forever hidden between two faded men on a forgotten Memphis street, or he would finally open his mouth and risk being misunderstood. As his hands shook and his voice thinned with age, the fear of twisting the memory started to feel smaller than the fear of never letting anyone see how human Elvis really was in that moment. For most of his life, people talked about Elvis in extremes. He was either the untouchable king or the sad cautionary tale. The friend, in his 80s now, knows the truth sits in a quieter place. When he finally says, "The night Elvis disappeared," he hears how it sounds. He knows people will imagine secret flights and new identities. That is not the story he is telling. He does not challenge the official ending. Doctors signed what they had to sign. The world has its date and its reports. What the world never saw is that, for him, Elvis began to disappear on a different night altogether. Outside that small church, in the stillness of a parked car, he listened to a man who was supposed to be larger-than-life talk in a calm voice about wanting to step out of his own skin. In that moment, something in Elvis let go. He spent years trying to find the right word for it. Depression felt too clinical. Exhaustion sounded too small. Fame was part of the story, but not all of it. The closest truth he can reach is this: hope slipped away. The belief that he could pull his life back into a shape that did not hurt slipped away. The part of Elvis that still believed he was a boy from Tupelo who had gotten lucky instead of a product that belonged to everyone else started to fade. Daily life did not stop when that happened. There were still bursts of the old magic. The friend can bring back the sound of Elvis laughing until he wiped tears from his eyes, the warmth of sudden generosity, the gentle way he could treat a stranger's child. Those memories shine, and they are real. Yet even in those moments, the friend saw a distance in his eyes, as if some part of him was standing just outside the room, watching. One short exchange near the end fixed that feeling in place. After a show that had gone better than most, they were alone for a minute. Elvis looked at his stage suit and, without turning his head, asked if the friend remembered the church. When the answer came, he said, "That was me trying to see who I was without all this." He did not add anything else. That single line told the friend more than any long speech could have. The man and the legend were pulling apart, and only the legend was being fed. For a long time, he kept that night and that sentence locked away. He believed that if he shared them, people would twist his meaning and use it as fuel for the rumors he despised. If the world heard that Elvis once vanished for a few hours and talked about not coming back, some would swear it proved their belief that he was still out there. What he wants them to hear instead is much harder to accept. Elvis did return to Graceland. He walked back through the gate sits. Kibachi Hanisepta Ashusta and Idigumenson and Bumsumwerdikshawn woke up under that same familiar ceiling. The disappearance he speaks of does not show up on a map. It is the point where a man's spirit steps back from a life that keeps marching forward without him. Growing old changed what he felt he owed this story. Standing at his own sink, lining up his own prescription bottles, he began to understand in his bones how it feels when your body and your name no longer match the person you remember being. Little by little, fear of feeding conspiracy theories shrank beside a different worry: that fans who loved Elvis might never be told how human he really felt in those last years. So breaking his silence now is not an attempt to rip away a myth. It is a way to add one missing piece. When someone leans on the Graceland gate or sings along alone in a car far from Memphis, he wants them to know they're not reaching toward a statue. They're reaching toward a man who, on at least one restless night, sat in the dark and wondered if anyone would still see him if the crown slipped. As his own life narrows, he accepts that people will keep arguing over what happened to Elvis. Some will hold fast to stories of escape. Others will only trust the medical files. Inside, he will always measure it differently. For him, the turning point came in that parked car outside a modest church when a tired voice admitted it did not recognize the life it was living. That is what he means when he says Elvis disappeared. Not a body vanishing into a new country, but a soul slowly stepping away from a story it could no longer carry. What brings him a small measure of peace is the thought that somewhere a listener will hear this and stop seeing Elvis as an untouchable monument. Maybe they will picture a complicated, fragile man who loved hard, gave more than he had, and who, for one lonely night, tried to step outside his own legend and could not quite find the way back. If you stayed with this story to the end, you are part of the small group who wants the man behind the legend, not just the myth. Subscribe, like, and tell us which untold night or relationship in Elvis's life you want us to gently uncover next on this channel.